while people are settling in, I'm Leila Phillip, the coordinator of the Creative Writing Program, so I want to say a couple of things about our series, and then a couple of words about our esteemed writer here tonight and get started. But I also have a very exciting announcement, which is that we have a new partnership with the Bedlam Books Cafe in Worcester, which is a great bookstore. So they're going to start selling books at our events, and there are going to be copies of this beautiful edition of Lawrence Joseph's poems, A Certain Clarity, selected poems. So the way it's going to work is she is out there with books for sale. She takes Venmo, credit cards, cash, and then we're going to... No cash? Okay, sorry. If you need help with that, because you don't have a credit card, you only have cash, you can talk to me, we can work something out. And then we'll sign the books in here. So buy a book outside, come back in, and if we run out of time for questions and you still have a question, there'll be time to ask questions up here during book signing. So, about our series, our next event is going to be March 23rd. After break, I know it's forever away, but put it in your calendar. It's March 23rd, a wonderful Filipino-American writer, Grace Talasan. Before we begin, I just want to say something briefly about this series, Writers on Vocation, and a quick thank you to Tom Landy here, the director of the McFarland Center, and Ruby Francis, who helped set this up. So this series is really indebted to Tom and the Lily Initiative. I think this started as a conversation many years ago. Yeah, we don't want to say how many, but Tom and I were talking, and anyway, we brainstormed this idea that we would have a series of lectures on writing and the writing life by nationally prominent writers. And the idea is that in these talks, writers would speak across genres. They would read their work and use it as a springboard to explore the topic of writing as a vocation. By definition, vocation means work that's carried out more for its altruistic benefit than its income. So even in secular terms, that implies more of a sense of calling, and indeed, vocare from the Latin literally means to call or invoke. And of course, in the biblical sense, vocation means service to God. But we were thinking to invite writers of all faiths and of all degrees of faith, and to consider the ways in which, as artists, they attempt to explore and engage questions of faith in their work and in what they do, and perhaps to consider questions such as, does the discipline of writing interact with the discipline of faith, and if so, how? And is the struggle to write well comparable to the struggle to maintain one's faith? And how might a writer's sense of vocation shape their relationship to their work? And some of the writers in this series have shared readings and spoken of a sense of how they've drawn inspiration from their faith, and others have spoken of the ways in which their system of belief is actually in conflict with their art. But all have shared their art, and that's what we are looking forward to tonight. And it's with great delight that I tell you a little bit about our esteemed writer of vocation tonight. Lawrence Joseph, the grandson of Lebanese and Syrian Catholic immigrants, is a poet and professor of law. He was born in Detroit, and he later graduated from law school at the University of Michigan. So he went on to build a career practicing and teaching law as well as writing poetry. He's the author of several collections of highly acclaimed poetry, including So Where Are We in 2017, and Codes, Precepts, Biases, and Taboos, Poems 1973 to 1993, published in 2005. His debut, Shouting at No One, published back in 1983, won the Agnes Lynch Starrett Prize. And Nicholas Gilowitz praised Into It, a 2005 book, which addresses the events of September 11th as an intimate book that counterintuitively and productively sidesteps confessionalism. Luminous and clear, Joseph's work is informed in interesting ways by his practice as a lawyer, and I think we'll hear that tonight. It engages themes of power and truth with an unsentimental clarity. He's won fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. He's the third recipient of the New York County Lawyers Association's Law and Literature Award, joining prior winners such as Louis Auchincloss and Louis Begley. And his poetry has been widely anthologized. He's the author also of prose works, including Lawyerland, which I want to read since I wrote Beaverland, What Lawyers Talk About When They Talk About Law in 1997. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Lawrence Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Phillip, for your kind introduction. I'd like to thank the McFarland Center and the Creative Writing Program. It's a great honor to be here. My talk this evening is on the vocation of the writer. It's in a number of parts, including a reading of several of my poems. 1. In Rome, not far from the Piazza Navona, is the Church of St. Louis of the French. It is the National Church of France in Rome. As you enter the church and walk along the side altars on the left toward the front altar, you come to the Contarelli Chapel, which contains paintings by the Baroque master Caravaggio about the life of St. Matthew, the apostle and author of the first of the four Gospels. The three paintings in the chapel are, on the left wall, the calling of St. Matthew, the inspiration of St. Matthew above the altar, and the martyrdom of St. Matthew on the right wall. One of the great fortunes of my life has been the hours I've been able to spend with Nancy, my wife, before this chapel, taking in the magnificence of these Caravaggio masterpieces during our visits to Rome. The calling of St. Matthew depicts the moment Christ calls Matthew to follow him. Caravaggio shows Matthew, the tax collector, sitting at a table with four other men. Jesus has entered the room and is pointing at Matthew, and Matthew is pointing at himself as if to ask me in response to Christ's calling. The martyrdom of St. Matthew is on the wall opposite to the calling of St. Matthew. According to tradition, Matthew was killed on the orders of the king of Ethiopia while celebrating Mass. The king lusted after his own niece and had been rebuked by Matthew. The painting captures St. Matthew recoiling as he falls before the fury of his executioner. Around the saint are persons showing terror and consternation at the killing, while an angel holds out the palm of martyrdom to Matthew as Matthew reaches for it. It is a painting about the death of a saint. Between the calling of St. Matthew and the martyrdom of St. Matthew is the altarpiece, the inspiration of St. Matthew, which you can see on the screen. Most of my time before the Contarelli Chapel has been spent focusing on the inspiration. For me, it's a painting about Matthew, the writer. How is the angel speaking to Matthew? This Matthew, the evangelist who was looking directly at the angel, pen in hand, poised to write. I see the inspiration as a calling, but different from Matthew's calling to be an apostle. I see the inspiration as a calling by an angel to Matthew to write. 2. Vocation, a word from the Old French, vocation, a call, a spiritual calling, or a calling to a profession. Vocation is rooted in the Latin vocationem, literally a calling, a being called. Vocationem in turn, is rooted in the Latin word vox. Vox means voice, sound, an utterance, a language, a word. The vocation is a calling, a being called through a voice, in language, in words. 3, I first knew that I would write poetry during my first semester as an undergraduate at the University of Michigan. I had elected an upper-level Introduction to Poetry course. After the professor took us through the poems, I remember feeling that I wanted to emulate this. I wanted to create poems that would have the same effect on a reader that these poems had on me. I've been writing poetry continuously since that fall of 1966. Writing poetry, making poems is, for me, a vocation. It is a calling in the sense that it is something that I feel impelled, compelled to do. As the poet-lawyer Wallace Stevens said, why does one write poetry? Because one is impelled to do so. And as the poet Dr. William Carlos Williams said, it's a compulsion. It's a necessity. 4, my grandparents, Lebanese and Syrian Catholics, emigrated to the United States and ultimately to Detroit shortly before World War I, where they ran grocery stores. They were among the first immigrants in Detroit from the Arab world. My parents were born in Detroit after World War I. They attended Catholic grade schools and high schools, as I later did. I was born shortly after World War II into a Detroit that was the 4th largest city in the United States, America's, if not the world's, greatest industrial city. After World War II, my father and my uncle inherited their father's store, which in the 1950s became a grocery liquor store. By 1960, it could no longer support 2 families, so my father went to work at A&P as a meat cutter, while also working at the store 3 nights a week. The store was badly damaged in Detroit's 1967 insurrection, riot, rebellion, and finally sold in the early 1970s. The Catholicism I was born into is integral to my imagination and to who I am. It's in my family, my ancestry, going back centuries. Catholicism for me is always here. An important part of my Catholicism is my high school years at the University of Detroit Jesuit High School, years that corresponded almost exactly with the years of Vatican II. Like James Joyce, who also was educated by Jesuits, I came to know the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola and their powerful spiritual expression of memory and sensuality. Catholicism for me is a faith morally identified with the human struggle for dignity and justice. It is a vision of the world incarnationally rooted in the senses, a faith of spoken and written words, Scripture, the Word of God, the Logos. William Carlos Williams, whose mother was Puerto Rican, wrote that to be Catholic is to be moral, to be positive, to be generous, to give because one has. Catholicism is a faith where tenderness may move, love may awaken. Catholicism confronts the all too human questions of the existence of evil, the experience of transcendence, the mystery of grace. Flannery O'Connor, one of our greatest American fiction writers, said her Catholicism allowed her to penetrate the surface of reality, to find in each thing the spirit that makes itself, to hold the world together. 5, Poetry for me is to paraphrase Ezra Pound, language charged with emotion to the utmost possible degree. Poetry is a way of thinking with one's feelings, a concentrated form of thinking. As the poet Adrian Rich said, poetry's medium is language intensified. It intensifies our sense of possible reality. Its deep structure is always musical and as physical as breath, as pulse. For me, the making of a poem is, to use Stephen's word, impelled. The making of a poem for me is an act of vocal composition, a combination of images, thoughts, observations, sounds, and sound patterns. I have, over the years that I've written poetry, created my own tradition, carrying on what is essentially a conversation with the work of other poets. It is a tradition that draws on the vast treasury of poetry from time immemorial, from the work of countless poets whose work I live with. My tradition of poetry includes poets who write with formal skill, poets who bear moral witness to power structures, violence, racism, misogyny, the oppression of the poor and weak. Poets who write of beauty and love, color and light. Poets who write out of the language of their interior worlds. The core of the identity of my work is the poet making the poems. But other identities, the poet who is Catholic, the poet who is Arab American, the poet who is a lawyer, the poet who's lived most of his life in Detroit and New York, are also always continuously at play. I'd now like to read several poems from my work. The first poem is entitled, I Was Appointed the Poet of Heaven. It's the prologue poem of my first book, Shouting at No One, and is a poem of a calling. It was written during my senior year in college as part of a long poem. When I was putting together the manuscript of Shouting at No One, I changed its ending so that it would lead into then the poem that follows it in the book. I will read then after I read I Was Appointed the Poet of Heaven. Then is set in my father's store in Detroit on the first night of Detroit's 1967 insurrection rebellion. I was appointed the poet of heaven. I was appointed the poet of heaven. It was my duty to describe Teresa's small roses as they bent in the wind. I tired of this and asked you to let me write about something else. You ordered, sit in the trees where the angels sleep and copy their breaths in verse. So I did, and soon I had a public following. St. Agnes with red cheeks, St. Dorothy with a moon between her fingers, and the hosts of heaven. You said, you failed me. I told you I'll write lovelier poems, but you answered, you've already had your chance. You will be pulled from a womb into a city. Then, Joseph breathed slower, as if that would stop the pain splitting his heart. He turned the ignition key to start the motor and leave Joseph's food market to those who wanted what was left. Take the canned peaches, take the greens, the turnips, drink the damn whiskey spilled on the floor, he might have said. The fire was eating half Detroit. Joseph could only think of how his father, with his bad legs, used to hunch over the cutting board, alone and light particled with sawdust behind the meat counter, and he began to cry. Had you been there, you would have been thinking of the old market's wooden walls turned to ash, or how Joseph's whole arm had been shaking as he stooped to pick up an onion, and you would have been afraid. You wouldn't have known that soon Joseph would stumble, his body paralyzed an instant from neck to groin. You would simply have shaken your head at the tenement named Barbara in flames, or the guardsman with an M16 looking in the window of Dave's Playboy barber shop, then closed your eyes and murmured, "This can't be." You wouldn't have known it would take 9 years before you'd realize the voice howling in you was born then. The next poem I'd like to read, In It, Into It, Inside It, Down In, is the first poem in my book, Into It. The poem begins with an answer to a calling. Into It is mostly set in Lower Manhattan, along the Hudson and East Rivers in New York Harbor, where Nancy and I have lived for 40 years. Into It covers the 1990s, and especially the early years of the 2000s. 9/11, the Iraq War, a time of extreme violence. In it, into it, inside it, down in. How far to go? I have to, I know, I promised. But how? How and when? And where? It was cold. The sky blue almost burst, leaves burnished yellow. Nearing Liberty, Liberty and Church Streets. So it happened in early November, which is to say, a story took place. Once again, new lines, new colors. One scene, then another. Characters talking to one another. It was she who opened the conversation. A wild rose and grapes on vines along the ground, a butterfly on the green palmetto, plums the size of walnuts, gray and vermilion. She sat up straighter, lips pressed together, looking me square in the eyes. And why, you tell me why, in this time of so much talk of morality, the weight of violence is unparalleled in the history of the species. What needs to be said? Why not say it? Who dares to learn what concerns him intimately is how he says it in his book. Then the mind runs through the spaces left behind, crossing over to a different place. Certainly was a well-dressed crowd. Here, again, the general, the attorney general, a beeper in one hand, a crucifix in the other. Here, again, language, a style, a groove, a fate. On the Esplanade, Battery Park, a newspaper, old, caught in a gust, a child, lost, crying. The pain was ours, I know it now. Beauty, the answer, if you must know. The sun ablaze on the harbor. Hearing a sentence phrased in a tenor, countertenor, an error of nature, after all, made of thought and of sound, of feeling seen. In it, into it, inside it, down in. The next poem, Inclined to Speak, is also an Into It. There's a reference in it to an exchange between two great poets of the 20th century, the German Bertolt Brecht and the Romanian Paul Celan. Brecht in the 1950s wrote a poem about writing poetry in a time of war and mass killing. Celan later responded to it. Inclined to Speak ends with a focus on the poet's voice. Inclined to speak. I saw that One woman, her personality and appearance described as lovely, while performing her pre-dawn prayers, watched the attackers shoot to death her husband, her 7-year-old son, 3 of her brothers, as they grabbed her 4-year-old son from her arms and cut his throat, taking her and her 2 sisters away on horses and raping them. Of course, it's genocide. And yes, it brings to mind, I am constantly aware of, in the making of the poem, Brecht's point, to write about trees, implicitly too, to write about pleasure in times of killing like these is a crime. And Paul Celan's response, that for Brecht, a leaf is a leaf without a tree. What kinds of times are these when a conversation, Celan believed a poem is a conversation, what kinds of times are these when a poem is a crime because it includes what must be made explicit? What is seen, heard, and imagined at the same time. That truth. Sort of relationship is established between our attention to what is further from us and what deepest in us. The immense enlargement of our perspectives is confronted by a reduction in our powers of action, which reduces a voice to an inner voice, inclined to speak only to those closest to us. The next poem, once again, is the last poem in Into It. It refers back to the call and promise made at the beginning of the book and ends with a reaffirming vow. Once again, the esplanade, high summer, the sea is beyond the sunset's light, the shapes amassed, the sky a current carrying us along, heavy with that green and that black. Fate's precisive wheel revolving, force's writhing wheel, the stealing, the killing, accomplished by new types of half-monsters. It's what I said. The poem is the dream, a dream technique, the primary soul substance of which our attention is fixed. Supernal, metaphysical, in other words, a representation, as we have seen, of mythical origins. Something felt, something needed, as much as we needed. A woman, a man, love's characters, the myth, their own. We are agreed. The moon is low, its silent flame across the garden of roses, almost level with the harbor. We place our hands on the silence and, once again, repeat the vow. And I'm going to read 3 more poems, and they're from my book, So Where Are We?, which was written during the 2010s, up to just before the 2016 presidential election. The first poem I'd like to read is the title poem. Nancy and I live a block away from what was Ground Zero. The opening of the poem refers back to the morning of September 11, 2001. My Catholicism is very much present throughout it. So where are we? So where were we? The fiery avalanche headed right at us, falling, flailing bodies in midair, the neighborhood under thick gray powder on every screen. I don't know where you are. I don't know what I'm going to do, I heard a man say. The man who had spoken was myself. What year? Which Southwest Asian war? Smoke from infants' brains, on fire from the phosphorus hours after they're killed, killers reveling in the horror. The more obscene, the better. The point at which 100,000 massacred is just a detail. Acid and credit bubbles about to burst. Too much consciousness of too much at once. A tangle of tenses and parallel thoughts. A series of feelings overlapping a sudden sensation, felt and known. Those chains of small facts repeated endlessly in the depths of silent time. So where are we? My ear turns like an animal's. I listen. Like it or not, a digital you is out there. Half of that city's buildings aren't there. Who was there when something was, and a witness to it? The rich boy general conducts the Pakistani heroin trade on a satellite phone from his cave. On the top floor of the Federal Reserve, in an office looking onto Liberty at the South Tower's one-time space, the Secretary of the Treasury concedes they got killed in terms of perceptions. 10 blocks away, the Church of the Transfiguration. In the back, a Byzantine Madonna. There's a God who fits the drama in a very particular sense. What you said, the memory of a remembered memory, the color of a memory, violet and black. The lunar eclipse on the winter solstice, the moon a red and black and copper hue. The streets, the harbor, the light, the sky. The blue and cloudless, intense and blue morning sky. The next poem, What More Is There to Say, is the last poem, and so where are we? What more is there to say? December mild, deep January cold. Sunlight filtered through blue haze. Yellow the grass closely pressed, patches of dirt, and red and lavender twilight, a tugboat in the harbor clearing the ice. In those circles in which all heaven breaks loose, touched by who she is, by what she wills. In the envisioned heart, inmost issues take the form of a credo. The God to whom an account must be rendered, my dead to whom I pray, as I in turn pray the life once theirs is transfigured. What a story to tell. Violence from the terror felt, violence in the suffering, violence in the mind, collectively modified, escalated to maximum speed. So what more is there to say? Many times the mass of the sun, solar masses, spiraling into space-time, radiating energy and gravitational waves, the edges of the islands soft in the black-gray sky on this side of the battery, near the ferry, a small bird's footprints here in the snow. New moon, mauve cloud, sea level higher than normal. The harbor again, green and gray, punctuated by waves lashing about. Thickening the mists this early morning, repeated sounds of foghorns we hear from afar. And finally, also from So Where Are We? A short poem, a psalm, a song, and it ends with an angel. I'd like again to thank the McFarland Center and the Creative Writing Program for having me here this evening, and my thanks to all of you. and for the record. Revelations reoccurring. He was babbling away in James Madison Plaza, and what goes around, what comes around. Light made holy by the fury of the tears with which it mingles. Simple enough when looked at directly. The child, shy and fearful, who won't speak. And for the record, the mind, like the night, has 1,000 eyes. Sparrows in the bushes. A small cat rolls in the snow. Sleet pounding the windows. In the space of a memory, the facade of a church, an angel on each side of a fiery wheel. Thank you.
Just a question from a layperson. So,
I'm sorry.
Just a question from a layperson, not specialist on poetics, poetic study. So, I noticed most of your poem you presented is religious. Do you have any poem about daily life or something like that?
I missed the end of your question.
Daily life. I mean.
Well, this is ordinary life. I mean, it's a part of ordinary life. If you mean by a domestic poems, I have mentioned, poems that mention domestic things, but that's not, the kind of what I'm trying to do in terms of the way that I'm and the making of the poem, and the poems that I want to make. They basically start with this type of being thrown into a situation of witness to violence, and the violence that existed has always existed, and it certainly is as existent now as ever, and you all live in it, and we all live in it, and so that's it. The walking on an esplanade in high summer is ordinary. It's just what you end up perceiving, and so and where your thoughts go. But all of my poems start somewhere in ordinary life, I think.
I can see that. Sorry for the wrong interpretation.
No. It's a good question. It's a very good question.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for coming and sharing your poems. I live in Manhattan too, so the so where are we really moved me. I'm just curious about your references to like Battery Park or James Madison Plaza, like where those inspirations come from or why you chose to include them.
I'm sorry, I missed the end of your question again.
Just where are the inspirations to like downtown Manhattan locations? I don't know, like where those inspirations came from or why you chose to include them?
We live there, and we live a block from Ground Zero, and I had gone out to teach at St. John's in Queens, and when I got there, the televisions were on, and and it was before the planes went into the towers. I got on the subway, and then when I got out to St. John's, the television was down in the students' room or the common room, and the first plane had hit. And then but my wife Nancy was at the apartment, and it was a primary day, and she had gone out to vote, and then she went back to the apartment. And then I called her. I got her on the phone after the first plane hit, and I told her to stay put because the World Trade Center had been bombed earlier in 1993, and it was said that it was an underground parking lot and there was explosives in a U-Haul, and if it had been 20 feet or 20 yards to one way or other, the whole tower would have fallen. But it didn't happen that way. People were killed. And we lived through that. And it was predicted that this wasn't going to be the last time it was going to happen. And it was in the neighborhood. And so I said, stay in the apartment. Don't go out on the street. And then I went back downstairs, and the second plane hit. And I went back upstairs and I called and I couldn't get through. Once the second tower was hit, everything was canceled out, all types of access to phones and everything. Television, electricity, everything went down. And then I ended up staying the night with a colleague of mine in Queens. And then the next morning I went down to try to find where Nancy was, because I didn't know where she was. I assumed she was in the apartment, but I don't know. And I hadn't heard from her. And nobody had heard from anybody, unless you'd gotten out of that space in some kind of way. And then I got down there the next day, and she was there, and we got out and into a deserted downtown Manhattan a day later, 1 block from Ground Zero. And then we walked down the Esplanade south toward the harbor and through the dust and everything. We walked all the way over to the F train in just east of Chinatown. And that was the only subway going out to Queens. And so we walked maybe a mile and a half, 2 miles. Nobody was on the street. Police, military, but it was the day after. And then we went out to Queens, and we were evacuated for 6 weeks. And we probably went back too early, but we went back. So that's the sort of backstory of it, which I don't put into this, because I'm not only writing about my own experience here, I'm writing about everybody else who had this experience, which, God forbid, those who suffered more and weren't as fortunate or weren't gifted with the grace or mercy of God that allowed us to be back together again. And what's happened since then, we still live there, and it's changed. And how many years now have passed? 22? Going to be 22 years. Some of you weren't born then. Probably many of you weren't born then. So you inherited this from older siblings, parents, grandparents, and whatever. And not only in New York City, but you inherited it everywhere in America. And then after that, we get the invasion of Iraq and war again. And that's the period of violence that's into it, that period. And so where are we? I go back to that. Because so where are we follows into it. So there's a gap in terms of time on that. And I pick up where I left off. That's basically what I did. So and I start with what's the bodies flailing, the images that are still in all of your minds. Even when you weren't alive, you've seen them. They're horrifying. They're horrifying to see them. If you're 19 years old, they're horrifying to see them. And, people's stories of that day. But it was on every screen, all over the world. And we're looking at it on screens. We're witnessing now things on screens, which is our lifetimes now. That's where we experience violence on a daily level, whatever way we experience it or don't. In the physical world, but in the virtual world, we live in that. We live in the violence of the virtual world, which is different. And that didn't exist before the virtual world. Not that type of violence. The violence of cyberspace, hacking, taking over. I don't have to explain this to any of you. Nobody. Needs no explanation. So that's the context of it.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, so thank you for sharing your poetry and your stories. I'm a political science major myself, but I'm also in creative writing classes. And I find it really inspiring that you were able to lead a life and do both of those things, be able to practice law and write poetry. And I'm just wondering, did you have any trouble balancing the two, or how did you find time to balance the two? And if being a lawyer has helped your poetry, or vice versa, if you think that they've played a role in each other. So.
Yeah, it requires a little bit of an answer, because it's something that has a context to it. I wrote poetry before I was a lawyer. And before I decided to be a lawyer, actually, although and my parents didn't go to college. They were born in the United States. They went to Catholic schools and got a good education, but they didn't go to college. And my generation, me and my cousins, we all went to college. I mean, it was one of the things we did. And we weren't going to, we were grandchildren of immigrants from a part of the world where there were not a lot of immigrants to the United States, and from the Arab world. And that's for purpose because of immigration laws, actually, and that's changed since 1965 when the immigration laws were changed. The only professional in my parents' generation was an uncle of mine who was a lawyer. He became a lawyer, and he was a kind of just a wonderful man. And my older brother, who was a lawyer, and I were very close to him, as all of us were, all of his children and nephews and nieces. And he became, role model isn't the right word, but it kind of, it was fascinated us. I mean, when we had, my brother and I, we both had interests in history and politics and growing up and whatever, and law. And so it's kind of not raised to be a lawyer, but kind of like raised to be a lawyer. And I'm not a child of immigrants. I'm a grandson of immigrants. But it was a very closely knit group. All of my aunts and uncles all married Lebanese and Syrian Catholics. So nobody in my generation, that hasn't been the case at all. So it's just this is part of just the ethno-history of a certain ethnic American Catholic group into it, at least, and then it's my story also on this. I first wanted to write poetry and realized I wanted to write poetry, put them on paper when I was a freshman, as I said in my talk, when I was a freshman at Michigan. But I've always felt, and this goes back to James Joyce, and I didn't mention it in my talk, that Joyce starts Portrait of the Artist as a young man with the child listening to sounds, and sort of, and it's very intricate. And it's about growing up as an artist, and it starts with childhood, and he's listening to people talking. He's an infant. He's listening to sounds, and then somebody starts to sing. And he starts to hear, and he puts the song out there. And it's an Irish, singer. And this little baby who comes, joining shows, tuned in, like right in, because he's the artist, and he's the poet, he's the writer. And writers are tuned on to voice, on to sound. That's the calling. It's voice. And that's, I think, what's true for me. I was listening. The baby, and the grandparents were speaking Arabic and English, mixed, parents speaking English, could speak some Arabic. Went to school, everybody was speaking with Catholic parochial schools, everybody was speaking English, of course, but, my Polish classmates would go home and their parents could have been, grandparents would have been speaking Polish. And so it was that kind of world. And then I went to the Jesuit high school where, again, this helped me both to understand myself as a writer and ultimately as the kind of writer I became. I did graduate work in England at Cambridge for 2 years, and we had a degree in literature there, and then returned and I went to law school. My brother had gone to law school and he had graduated, and I decided, and I was in Europe when I decided this, that I needed to make a living. And at that time, there weren't MFA programs, creative writing programs. There were like 5 of them, or 3 of them. And the alternative would have been for my degrees of teaching English. And the market was very tight. The market's always tight, and it was tight back then. And I decided that, what I'll do is, I'll do what Wallace Stevens had done, and William Carlos Williams had done. They had another profession. And so I decided that's what I'll do, and I'll just do both of them. And I'll try to do as well as I can in both of them. I won't use one of them as a way to, but I sort of went in both ways on it, but primarily as a poet. And the primary impetus, if you like, was to protect the poetry, in great part because if I was outside of the literary world, which at least outside professionally, the literary world, even teaching English would have been being in the literary world, I would be free to write whatever I wanted because I would be making my living separately. And so that played heavily into it. I think things have changed since that time. And I think the situation now is one where you're all very aware, and you have let's say you have a very strong political consciousness, which is understandable in the times that we live in, inescapable in many ways, and how you deal with it, and how you live in it, and how you protect yourself from it, and protect your friends and the ones you love from it, and whatever. But you have this consciousness, and that's just historical. I mean, it's a different time than it was even in the tumultuous time that I was making these decisions. And you've got that, and you want to write. You want to write poetry, you want to write fiction, you want to write serious nonfiction, literary nonfiction, and but you don't know how you're going to make a living. And that's the question you all face. And what you're finding is, I don't know the number, but I would say thousands of you are figuring out a way to make a living and to continue to write. And if you're impelled to do it, you'll do it. You'll do it if you have a calling to do it. Any calling that you have, you may want to think about whatever the calling to do what you do as something that you really feel you need to do. You're impelled to do it. It may take time to find it. You don't get it right away, but of course you're not going to get it right away. You're growing, you're experiencing, and the world changes. And I don't have to tell you that. How much has it changed since this morning and what's been going on your screens and what you've looked at on your screens? Okay? And so that would be the answer to your question.
Thank you. It was very inspiring.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.